Nullward 9 was not the largest detention facility in compact space. It was the fourth largest. This distinction mattered to its administrative staff in the way that small rankings matter to institutions that have learned to find pride in precision. They were not the best, but they were specifically and measurably not the worst. And in a facility holding 47,000 inmates across 4,000 species classifications, not the worst was considered a significant operational achievement. The facility occupied an artificial station in deep space, positioned equidistant from three compact member systems, a location chosen, as the original construction brief noted, for its logistical neutrality and its complete absence of any natural escape vector. There was nothing within 17 hours of transit in any direction. The nearest inhabited world was a Prethori border installation, whose personnel had standing orders not to respond to unscheduled contact from the facility's coordinates. Nullward 9 held, at the time of the events described in this record, 47,211 inmates. It held 4,012 distinct species. This last fact is what made Nullward 9 unique among compact detention facilities and what had earned it, among the administrative staff of the wider penitentiary system, the informal designation, the impossible problem. 47,000 inmates, 4,000 species, 4,000 sets of biological requirements, atmospheric tolerances, dietary needs, sleep cycles, ambient temperature ranges, social structures, communication modalities, sensory profiles. 4,000 potential points of interspecies conflict. 4,000 different ways an inmate population could become unmanageable. The standing joke among Nullward 9 staff, repeated at every new guard orientation, was that the facility had been designed by someone who had never worked in a detention facility and built by someone who had never met an alien. It was not entirely a joke. The facility ran, that was the honest summary of its operational status, not well, not efficiently, not with anything approaching the calm control that the Compact's Penitentiary Oversight Commission described in its annual assessment standards. It ran in the way of a machine with too many moving parts and not enough maintenance. Through constant small interventions by staff who had learned, through years of practice, exactly which pressure points to manage and in what sequence, and who understood that the moment they stopped managing was the moment something would break. Warden Second Cathamal had been at Nullward 9 for 6 years. He had arrived as a junior administrator and risen through attrition as much as competence. His 3 predecessors in the Warden's second role had all requested transfers within 2 years, citing what the official records described as administrative stress, and what the unofficial record described more simply as the slow erosion of the belief that any of it was working. Cathamal had stayed. He had stayed because he was stubborn, and because he was, in the specific way of people who cannot tolerate unsolved problems, unable to leave one. Nullward 9 was the largest unsolved problem he had ever encountered. He was still working on it when, on the morning of Administrative Cycle 4912, a transport shuttle docked at Nullward 9 Intake Bay and delivered, among 31 other new inmates, a single human. Her name, according to the intake manifest, was Yale Davin. Her listed offense, violation of Compact Trade Regulation 7, subsection 14, specifically, operating a commercial enterprise without compact licensing in a restricted trade corridor. The sentence, 4 years. Her listed occupation, logistics coordinator. Her listed age, 38. Her listed physical classification, grade 3 fragile biomorph standard. Cathamal reviewed the intake manifest that morning as he reviewed all intake manifests, quickly, thoroughly, flagging anything that warranted special housing or handling. He flagged 1 inmate for atmospheric accommodation, 2 for dietary requirements outside the standard supply chain, and one whose species had a documented violent conflict history with the Praetori inmates in Block 7. He did not flag Yale Davins. She required standard human accommodation, oxygen, nitrogen atmosphere, moderate temperature, standard food provisions, no conflict flags in the species registry, no prior detention record, no medical requirements. Standard intake, standard housing assignment, Block 14, cell allocation 1477. He signed off on the manifest and moved on to the morning's maintenance reports. He did not think about her again until day 4. I want to begin my account with something that the Commission's preliminary report glosses over, and which I believe is essential context for understanding everything that followed. Nullward 9 does not function uncontrolled. I know that is not what the facility's operating manual says. The manual describes a system of hierarchical authority, behavioral incentive structures, and security protocols that together produce what it calls a managed environment. The manual was written by people who visited Nullward 9 for 3 days on an inspection tour and then went home. What Nullward 9 actually functions on is negotiated tolerance. 47,000 inmates across 4,000 species cannot be controlled. That is not a management failure. It is mathematics. We have 800 guard personnel. The ratio is approximately 1 to 59. In any direct confrontation between the guard staff and a unified inmate population, the guard staff loses. This is known. It has always been known. The security of Nullward 9 rests not on the ability to overpower the inmate population, but on the fact that the inmate population is not unified. 4,000 species, 4,000 sets of incompatible interests, 4,000 sets of incompatible biological needs. They cannot cooperate. They cannot communicate across the full breadth of that diversity. The facility's internal translation systems cover approximately 60% of the species present, which means that at any given moment, 40% of our inmate population cannot meaningfully communicate with any guard or with approximately half of their fellow inmates. They cannot organize because they cannot talk to each other. This is not an accident. The Commission should understand that it is not an accident. The facility was designed to house as many species as possible precisely because diversity is, in a detention context, a security mechanism. You do not need walls if your inmates cannot form a common cause. That is what I knew, going into day 1 of administrative cycle 4912. I am telling you this because what happened over the following 11 days only makes sense if you understand that Nullward 9's security model was premised entirely on one assumption. The assumption that the inmates could not talk to each other. Day 1, I started on day 1 because you always start on day 1. You don't wait until you understand the full situation. You gather information while you move. Waiting to understand completely before acting is how problems become permanent. What I noticed on day 1, the facility was running on exhaustion, not the guards, the system. The logistics of feeding 47,000 inmates across 4,000 dietary profiles was a daily crisis that the kitchen staff were managing through a combination of overcautious bulk ordering, massive waste, and a black market exchange among inmates who received food incompatible with their biology and traded it to species who could use it. The trading network already existed. That was the first important thing I noticed. The inmates were already trading, which meant they were already communicating, not through language, through objects. Food, primarily, but also materials, small manufactured items, things that had been repurposed from their intended function. The communication was there, it just didn't have a structure. The second thing I noticed, the translation gap. 60% coverage means 40% of the facility's population is linguistically isolated, but isolated doesn't mean incommunicative. Body language crosses species lines more reliably than we give it credit for. Gesture, proximity, repetition. I spent day one watching how inmates who didn't share a language managed to communicate anyway. They managed, slowly and precisely, but they managed. The third thing I noticed, the guard rotation schedule had a pattern, not a flaw, a rhythm. Every institution has a rhythm, and the rhythm tells you where the attention is and where it isn't. I clocked the rotation in the first 6 hours. By the end of day one, I knew the facility's attention schedule as well as any guard who'd worked there for 6 months. None of this was secret. It was all observable by anyone who was paying attention. I was paying attention. Day two, I started talking. She sat next to me at the meal allocation point on day two. I want to be clear that I did not consider this suspicious at the time. The meal allocation point for Block 14 is crowded and seating is not assigned. She sat next to me because there was space. She looked at my food allocation. I am Murath-Selun. Our dietary requirements are very specific, and the facility's kitchen produces something that technically meets our nutritional parameters but which tastes, in my assessment, like compressed regret. And she said, in passable Murath-Selun trade dialect, "That looks wrong." I said it was nutritionally compliant. She said, compliant and correct are different things. You need the secondary enzyme compound. They're not including it. It's a formulation issue, not a supply issue. The raw ingredients are in the kitchen stores. Someone just doesn't know they need to be combined in a specific sequence before the heating cycle. I looked at her. She was a human. I had not previously encountered a human who spoke Murath-Selun trade dialect or who knew anything about our secondary enzyme requirements. I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I did a logistics contract in the Murath-Selun Reach for 2 years. I managed supply chains for 17 species. You learn the dietary profiles or you lose the contracts." I said, "You can fix the food." She said, "I can tell someone who can fix the food. I need to find out who runs the kitchen coordination. Do you know any of the kitchen staff?" I knew one, a Keth-Narul inmate who worked the kitchen assignment because it gave him access to supplemental heat, which his species requires. As I told her, she thanked me. She moved to a different seat. I watched where she went. She sat next to a being I recognized as Thal-Sewer, a Varun who had been at Nullward 9 for 3 years and who was, by informal inmate consensus, the closest thing Block 7 had to a reliable source of information about facility operations. Thal-Sewer had worked briefly in facility administration before a disciplinary reassignment. He knew things. She talked to Thal-Sewer for approximately 8 minutes. He did most of the talking. She listened. I had been in Nullward 9 for 11 months. I had never thought to sit next to Thal-Sewer and listen for 8 minutes. I thought about that for a while. She asked good questions. Not impressive questions. Not questions that required specialized knowledge. Good questions, the kind that show someone has been thinking about a problem structurally and wants to confirm their model before they act on it. She asked about the translation gap. Specifically, she asked whether the 40% of inmates without translation coverage were distributed randomly through the facility or clustered. I said clustered. The facility had, over time, developed informal block arrangements that grouped species with compatible biologies, atmospheric requirements, temperature preferences, that sort of thing. Translation coverage correlated with the larger species groupings. She asked, of the 40% without coverage, what was the largest single language group? I said the Pellucid dialects, approximately 4,000 inmates. No compact translation matrix covers Pellucid adequately. The language is gesture primary with tonal overlay, and the compact's translation technology doesn't handle gesture primary languages well. She asked, where are they housed? I said blocks 20 through 24 primary. She said, "Is there anyone in those blocks who's been here long enough to have developed informal gesture communication with non-pellucid inmates? A pigeon, a contact system?" I had to think about it. Then I said, yes. There was a Gel inmate in Block 22 named Vethron who had been at Nullward 9 for 7 years and who had, I had heard, developed a working nonverbal system with several pellucid inmates that allowed for basic communication. It was informal, not sophisticated, but it functioned. She asked, was Vethron someone the other pellucid inmates trusted? I said I believed so. He had a reputation for being fair. She said, thank you, you've been helpful. She stood to leave. I said, what are you doing? She paused. She looked at me with an expression that I found difficult to read, but which I think in retrospect was the expression of someone deciding how honest to be. She said, I am finding the edges of the network that already exists and connecting them to each other. I said, why? She said, because this facility is running badly and everyone in it is suffering from that, including the guards. A badly run facility is dangerous for everyone. A well-run facility is better for everyone. I'm going to see if I can improve the run. I said, you have been here for 2 days. She said, I know, I'm behind schedule. She walked away. I sat there for a moment. Then I thought, she is either going to be the most dangerous person in this facility within a week, or she is going to get herself put in solitary by day 5. I was curious which. I became aware of inmate 1477 on day 4. Not because she had done anything visible, because something had changed in Block 14 and I couldn't identify the source. Block 14 had a chronic tension problem. 3 species with overlapping territorial instincts and incompatible smell profiles had been housed in proximity for 2 years, and the result was a low-level constant friction that required guard intervention approximately 3 times per week, never escalating to serious violence, but never fully resolving either. On day 3, the intervention rate in Block 14 dropped to 0. On day 4, it remained 0. I pulled the Block 14 guard reports, nothing notable, no confrontations, no complaints filed. The 3 species were present and accounted for in their normal locations, doing nothing that any report flagged. I asked the Block 14 senior guard, a veteran named Velketh who had worked that block for 4 years, what had changed. He said he didn't know. He said the tension had just reduced. He said the 3 species groups had since day 3 been maintaining slightly different spacing than usual, not segregated, just positioned in a way that minimized olfactory overlap. He said he had noticed it but hadn't thought much of it because it was a good thing. I asked if anything had happened on day 2 or 3 that might have precipitated it. He said he had seen one of the new intakes, a human woman, Block 14, speaking separately with members of each of the 3 species groups on day 2, brief conversations. He hadn't thought much of it because the conversations appeared friendly and uneventful. I looked at the intake manifest again. Yale Davin, Logistics Coordinator, 38 years old. I pulled her file more carefully this time. Her listed offense, violation of Trade Regulation 7 subsection 14, was for operating an unlicensed brokerage in the restricted reach corridor. A brokerage, not a manufacturing operation, not a resource extraction enterprise, a brokerage, a middleman operation. Her employment history, which the intake process collected but which I had not previously reviewed. 12 years as an independent logistics coordinator, contracts across 47 species territories, specialization in what her own records described as multi-party supply chain resolution for high-complexity environments. Multi-party supply chain resolution for high-complexity environments. I sat with that phrase for a moment. I thought about Block 14's three incompatible species groups suddenly. On day 3, maintaining spacing that minimized olfactory conflict without any guard intervention. I thought about what a logistics coordinator who had spent 12 years resolving supply chains across 47 species might notice about the spacing problem in Block 14 within 2 days of arrival. I flagged her file for monitoring. I was approximately 3 days too late. Day 3 was the kitchen. I had, through Rethvon, made contact with the Keth Narwhal kitchen worker. His name was Sarath Moon, and he had been working the kitchen assignment for 2 years and knew the stores, the equipment, and the rotation schedule better than any guard. He also had, I discovered, a working relationship with approximately 14 other kitchen workers across 6 species, built over 2 years of shared shifts and the universal language of people who are tired and working in a hot room. I explained the Murath Selun's secondary enzyme formulation issue to Sarath Moon. He understood it within about 4 minutes. He said he had wondered why the Murath Selun inmates always looked slightly unwell after meals. I said there are probably 11 other formulation issues in the current kitchen output that are producing suboptimal nutrition across various species. If you want, I can work through them with you. Oh, he said yes. We spent 2 hours going through the kitchen's current supply inventory and meal production protocols. I identified 8 additional formulation issues, not dangerous ones. The kitchen was meeting minimum compact nutritional standards, but minimum standards and actual well-being are different things. Small adjustments. Different sequencing, different temperature timing, one combination that required 2 separate stores to be mixed rather than used independently. None of it required new supplies. All of it was achievable with what the kitchen already had. Sarath Moon implemented the first 3 changes that afternoon. By the following morning, his kitchen crew had noticed that the Monathi and Keth Narwhal inmates were eating more and complaining less. This is the kind of change that a kitchen crew notices because it makes their job easier. Kitchen crews talk, especially kitchen crews that have been working together for 2 years. By day 4, 7 species had noticed the food was better. When food improves in a facility like Nullward 9, people notice and they ask why, and the story travels. The story traveled, and at the end of the story was a name. I had not told anyone my name, they found it out anyway. That is how stories work. Day 4, I was approached by 3 inmates I had not previously spoken to, from 3 species I had not yet made contact with, who had heard that there was a new human intake who could talk to people and solve things, and they wanted to know if I could talk to them. I said yes. I said yes to all 3 of them. I want to say, for the record, that nothing she did was against facility rules. I reviewed the rule book after the commission started its inquiry. I was looking for what she had violated. I wanted to find because I wanted to understand what I should have reported and when. I couldn't find it. The facility rulebook prohibits violence, property destruction, unauthorized access to restricted areas, possession of prohibited materials, interference with guard operations, attempts to suborn guard staff. She did none of those things. What she did was she talked to people. She walked around the common areas and the meal points and the exercise allocation zones, and she talked to people. She listened to them. She asked them questions. She occasionally conveyed information from one group to another, not secrets, not security-sensitive information, just relevant practical knowledge. She told the Thunvel cluster in Block 12 that the ambient temperature in the East Common area dropped by approximately 3 degrees in the late afternoon if you positioned yourself near the atmospheric vent, which their biology preferred. She told the Pellucid group in Block 23 that the noise levels in the central corridor peaked during shift change, and if they needed quiet for their sleep cycle, they should request the East Wing allocation. Small things. Practical things. Information that made people's daily experience of this facility marginally less miserable. None of it was against the rules. But by day 5, I noticed something that I want to describe as precisely as I can, because I think it is the most important thing in this account. The facility felt different. Not quiet, Nullward 9 is never quiet, but the quality of the noise had changed. There is a kind of noise that comes from 47,000 beings in contained stress, a constant low-frequency tension that you stop consciously hearing after about 6 months but that you feel all the time at the base of your skull. I had lived with it for 4 years. By day 5, it had reduced. Not gone, reduced. I didn't report it to the warden second. I didn't know how to describe it in a report format. How do you write? The facility feels different, and I believe a human logistics coordinator who has been here for 5 days is responsible. I should have reported it. I understand that now. Part 3 DAYS 7 through 10. On day 7, I called inmate 1477 to my office. I want to describe that meeting carefully because I think it is the fulcrum of the entire account. She arrived on time, which is not unusual, and sat in the chair across from my desk without waiting to be told to sit, which is slightly unusual, and looked at me with the specific quality of attention I had by then come to associate with her. The attention of someone who is gathering information while appearing simply to be present. I had prepared a list of observations: the Block 14 tension reduction, the kitchen changes, the 312 cross-species conversations my monitoring team had logged her having in the previous 5 days. The fact that my guard staff had, with no formal change in protocol, reduced their Block 14 intervention rate by 90% and were reporting when I asked them informally that the block was running easier. I put the list on the desk. I said, "Tell me what you're doing." She looked at the list. She did not appear surprised by it. She said, "I'm doing what I know how to do. I'm a logistics coordinator. I coordinate logistics." I said, "In a detention facility." She said, "Logistics don't stop being logistics because of the location. You have 47,000 beings with 4,000 different sets of requirements living in a single constrained space with inadequate communication infrastructure and a resource allocation system that was designed for efficiency rather than compatibility. That is a logistics problem. I am applying logistics solutions." I said, "You have been here for 7 days." She said, "I know, I'm sorry about the timeline. It's a complex environment." I said, "I should put you in solitary." She said, "You could. I'd like to suggest that would be counterproductive." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I have 17 ongoing conversations at various stages of development that are producing measurable improvements in facility stability. And if I disappear from those conversations, 3 of them will likely deteriorate without resolution, and 2 of them will probably produce the confrontations they are currently preventing." As I looked at hers, I said, "You have 17 ongoing conversations." She said, 17 primary ones. There are more peripheral ones." I said, "How many more?" She said, "I stopped counting precisely at about 40. I'd estimate, as of this morning, approximately 60 to 70 active relationships at various depths." I said, "You have been here for 7 days." She said, "You keep saying that. I understand why. I'm not trying to be destabilizing, Warden Second. I'm trying to be helpful. This facility is running at about 40% of its potential. Stability, the gap between 40% and 60 or 70%, is not a resource problem or a staffing problem. It's an information problem. People here don't know things that would help them, and they don't know them because there's no structure for information to travel across species lines. I'm providing a structure." I said, "By yourself." She said, "To start, the goal is not for me to be the structure permanently. The goal is to build something that runs without me. I won't be here forever. I have 4 years. That's enough time to build something that lasts. I sat with that. She was planning for the continuation of whatever she was building after her own release. She was, in a detention facility she had been in for 7 days, thinking in terms of institutional legacy. I said, "What do you want?" She said, "I don't want anything. I want the Murath Selun food to keep being formulated correctly. I want the 3 species groups in Block 14 to maintain the spacing arrangement they've developed. I want the 17 conversations I mentioned to reach their natural conclusions. Beyond that, I don't have specific wants. I have a general preference for things functioning better than they currently do." I said, "You are a prisoner here." She said, "I am, and this is the environment I'm in for 4 years, and I have 2 choices about what to do with that time. I can be present in it and useful, or I can serve my time and leave without having done anything with it. The second option seems like a waste." I looked at the list of observations on my desk. I said, "What are the 17 conversations?" She told me. I will not reproduce that conversation in full because it ran for nearly 2 hours and covers material I have addressed to the Commission in my technical supplemental. But the summary is this. She described 17 interspecies tensions, resource conflicts, or communication failures that she was actively mediating. Each one described with a specificity and an understanding of the species involved that took me at points, genuine effort to follow. She knew the conflict histories, the biological incompatibilities, the specific trigger points. She knew things about the inmate population of Nullward 9 that I, after 6 years, did not know. At the end of the 2 hours, I asked her one more question. I said, "How did you learn all of this in 7 days?" She said, "I asked people, and I listened. People will tell you almost anything if you ask them a real question and then actually listen to the answer." She paused. "Most people don't do both. They ask and then they wait for the answer to be over. I listen." She said it without self-congratulation, as a plain description of a technique. I thought about 6 years of guard reports that described inmate behavior in 3-word summaries. I said, "I'm not putting you in solitary." She said, "I appreciate that." I said, "I'm also not officially authorizing what you're doing." She said, "I understand. I'm not asking for authorization." She left. I sat in my office for a long time. Then I called in my senior guard staff, and I started asking them real questions about what they observed in the facility. For the first time in 6 years, I listened to the full answers. Days 7 through 10 were the structural phase. The conversations I had been having were, individually, useful, but conversations don't persist. People forget. New intakes arrive and don't know the arrangements. The tensions that have been reduced by one specific conversation can rebuild if there's nothing to maintain the reduction. You need structure, not rules. Rules need enforcement, and enforcement needs power, and I had no formal power. You need something that people maintain themselves because maintaining it serves them. I called it the exchange. Other people called it other things in their own languages. The name doesn't matter. The concept was simple. Information and small goods moving across species lines through a network of voluntary intermediaries, each one serving as a node between 2 or 3 species they had some existing relationship with. No hierarchy, no central control, no rules beyond. What travels through the network must benefit the receiver, not just the sender. The kitchen was already a partial node. Sorath Moon had been exchanging information about food preferences for 2 years without thinking of it as a network. I helped him understand it as a network and identify 3 other kitchen workers who could extend it. The pellucid communication problem was solved by day 8. Veth-Korum, the gel inmate who had developed the gesture contact system, was willing to formalize it to teach it to 6 other inmates across 4 species who could extend its reach. The system would never be comprehensive, but it didn't need to be. You don't need everyone to speak the same language. You need enough relay points that information can travel. Although 3 species territorial situation in Block 14 was stable but fragile. I spent 2 hours on day 9 with representatives from each group establishing a mutual acknowledgement protocol. Not a peace treaty, nothing that formal, just an understood set of signals that each group would use to communicate non-hostile intent when moving through shared space. Borrowed gesture elements from 3 different species' body language libraries. Simple enough to remember, clear enough to be unambiguous. Day 10, the network had enough nodes that I could step back from active daily management and let it run. Not perfectly, not without friction, but running. 47,000 inmates across 4,000 species, and information was beginning to travel between them. Small information, practical information where the warm corner is when the noise peaks, which food allocation works for which biology, which guard is on rotation and what their personal blind spots are. I won't pretend that one wasn't in the network too because it was and it probably shouldn't have been, but I couldn't remove it without removing the trust that made the network function. On day 10, I sat in the East Common area at the time I had told the Thunvel cluster about the temperature drop in the late afternoon near the atmospheric vent, and I watched. The Thunvel cluster was there. They had come for the temperature as I had said they would. Across the common area, a group of Keth-Narul inmates were playing a physical game that involved a great deal of controlled noise and movement. Normally, the Thunvel found this proximity stressful. They are a quiet species and the Keth-Narul are not. But someone, I believe it was Rethvan, who had become an unexpectedly committed node in the network, had spoken with both groups. The Keth-Narul game had migrated about 4 meters toward the far wall. The Thunvel had, correspondingly, moved their cluster slightly toward the vent. Nobody had told them to, no guard had intervened, no rule had been enforced. They had just adjusted. Because someone had told someone who had told someone else, and the information had traveled, and the adjustment had been made because it cost the Keth-Narul nothing and it gave the Thunvel something. I watched this for about 20 minutes. Then I went back to my cell and I wrote down everything I had built in 10 days, in as much detail as I could in 12 languages. Because I needed it to survive without me. On day 11, I received a communication from the Compact's Penitentiary Oversight Commission, informing me that Nullward 9 would be subject to an unscheduled administrative review the following month. The reviews are not unusual. What was unusual was the reasons cited. The Commission had detected anomalous patterns in our incident report data. Specifically, the intervention rate across the facility had dropped by 31% in 11 days. A 31% drop in 11 days. The Commission wanted to know what had changed. I read the communications. I thought about Yale Davin in my office on day 7, telling me she had 60 to 70 active relationships and that her goal was to build something that ran without her. I thought about the Thunvel cluster in the East Common area and the Keth-Narul game that had moved 4 meters. I thought about my senior guard staff, who had spent the last 4 days telling me things about the facility they had never told me before, because I had started asking real questions. I thought about 6 years of managing a facility whose security model was premised on the inmates' inability to communicate, and about a logistics coordinator from a grade 3 fragile biomorph species who had been here for 11 days and had, apparently, solved the communication problem. I made a decision. I called Davin back to my office. She sat down, she waited. I said, the Commission is reviewing our incident data. There's going to be a formal inquiry into why our numbers have changed. She said, I expected that. I said, When they arrive, they will review the facility and they will find a communication network operating among the inmate population that has no official authorization, and that contradicts the facility's security model. Oh, she said, yes. I said that is going to produce a significant institutional response. Oh, she said, probably. I said they will want to dismantle it. Oh, she said they will try. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means they can remove me and they can remove any specific node they can identify, but they cannot remove the knowledge that the nodes have, and they cannot unlearn the relationships that have formed, and they cannot make the Keth Narwhal game move back to where it was once. The Thunvel have understood that they don't have to be stressed in the East Common area in the afternoon. She paused. They can dismantle the structure. Why cannot dismantle what the structure has already done? What's been learned stays learned. I said they will want to know who built it. She said, I know. I said I could tell them it was an unauthorized inmate activity and process it as a disciplinary matter. She looked at me. I said, or I could tell them something else. She waited. I said, I spent 6 years running this facility on a model that was, in retrospect, based on a premise that I understood intellectually but never examined operationally. The premise that diversity is a security mechanism, that 4,000 species who can't communicate are more controllable than 4,000 species who can. She said nothing. I said the premise is correct in a narrow sense. They cannot overthrow the facility if they cannot organize, but they also cannot reduce their own suffering if they cannot communicate. And a population in continuous unnecessary suffering is not actually a controlled population. It is a potential explosion waiting for a sufficient trigger. She said, yes. I said what you built is not a security threat. She said, no. I said it is, in some respects, the opposite of a security threat. She said, yes. I said, I am going to tell the Commission that the incident reduction is the result of an experimental inmate welfare initiative that I authorized and supervised. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, Warden Second, you will be taking professional responsibility for something that you did not authorize. I said I am authorizing it now, retroactively. She said that is not how authorization works. I said I am the Warden Second of this facility. I am making a decision about how it runs. That is how it works. She was quiet. I said I would like your help preparing the documentation. She said, you would like me to help you document a welfare initiative that you retroactively authorized. I said, I would like you to help me document what has actually happened here in 11 days in language that the Commission can receive and process without dismantling the first improvement this facility has had in its operational history. She thought about that. She said, you have paper. I did. We spent 4 hours in my office writing. What we produced was, technically, a program proposal, framed as an initiative I had approved on intake of a qualified logistics coordinator, designed to address the facility's chronic interspecies communication deficits through a structured voluntary information exchange network operating entirely within existing rules. As everything in it was true. The framing was creative. She wrote most of it. I revised the sections where her directness exceeded what the Commission's institutional culture could absorb. She revised the sections where my institutional language had softened the reality past the point of accuracy. After 2 hours, the document was honest enough to be defensible and legible enough to be received. After 4 hours, it was good. I read it when we finished. I said, this is better than any program proposal I have written in 6 years. She said it's a good program, good programs write well. She gathered the draft and prepared to take it to her cell to finalize. At the door, she paused. She said, Warden Second, why are you doing this? I said, because the facility is better than it was 11 days ago, and I do not want it to go back. She said it won't go back entirely. The relationships will persist. I said, I know, but I want the program to persist too. I want the structure to have official standing so it can grow instead of being managed in the shadows. She said, you want to run a better facility. I said, I have always wanted to run a better facility. I have been waiting 6 years for someone to show me how. She looked at me with the same expression she'd had when I first called her to my office, the one I couldn't quite read. I understood it now. It was the expression of someone recalibrating, of someone who had expected one thing and found another. She said, I'll have the final draft to you by morning. All she did. The commission reviewed the program proposal. The commission reviewed the incident data. The commission sent an inspection team. The inspection team arrived and found a facility that was, by every measurable standard, running better than it had at any previous inspection. The interspecies conflict rate was down 37% by the time they arrived. It had continued to improve after day 11. The kitchen was producing measurably better nutritional outcomes across 14 species profiles. The guard staff were reporting lower operational stress. The inspection team interviewed guards, kitchen workers, and selected inmates. Every guard said the facility felt different. The Murath Selun inmate Rethvon, when interviewed, said that the food was better and that he understood now why it had been worse. Thal Sewer of the Varun said that information traveled better than it used to, and that this made daily life less dangerous. Vethron, the Gel inmate, demonstrated the gesture contact system to the inspection team's communications specialist, who spent 40 minutes with him and then sent a private message to her supervisor that I was later told said, "This is better than what we use in 3 of our border stations. I want to document it." The commission approved the program. The program was not approved with any particular enthusiasm. It was approved the way institutions approve things that have already happened and cannot be undone, and are producing results that are difficult to argue against, with formal language and an absence of acknowledgement that what they were approving was anything other than a standard administrative procedure. But it was approved. Yale Davin was given a formal program coordinator designation, unpaid, with no status implications for her inmate classification, but real in the sense that it gave the network an official standing it had not previously had. She said thank you and went back to work. She served the full 4 years of her sentence. In those 4 years, the incident rate at Nullward 9 dropped 61%. The nutritional outcomes improved across 22 species profiles. The translation gap was partially addressed through a compact-funded gesture language documentation project that originated from Vethron's system and eventually produced materials used in 3 other facilities. The facility did not become something from a manual. It did not become the managed environment the operational documentation described. It became something else, something that did not have an official name in the penitentiary system's classification framework. A place where 47,000 beings across 4,000 species knew a little more about each other than they had before. Knew that the Thunvel needed quiet in the afternoon. Knew that the Murath Selun food needed the secondary enzyme. Knew that the Keth Narul game could move 4 meters and nobody would miss the space. Knew that information could travel if someone was willing to carry it. On the day Yale Davin was released, she met with me one final time. I said, "What will you do?" She said, go back to logistics coordination. I have some contracts to rebuild. I said the network will persist. She said, yes, the nodes know what they're doing now. They don't need me. She had said that on day 7, that the goal was to build something that ran without her. Oh, she had done it. I said 4,000 species. Oh, she said give or take. I said 11 days to build the structure. She said the structure was already there. I just connected the pieces. She picked up her bag. She said, you asked good questions, Warden Second, at the end, when you started asking. I said I learned from someone. She smiled. She left. I went back to my office. I pulled up the intake manifest from the next arriving transport. I read every file. All the way through. The Penitentiary Oversight Commission's formal inquiry into